Victoria, we have a democratic elected voice. It's called the First People's Assembly of Victoria. I'm one of the co-chairs. My question is, what can the panellists say to reassure us that the voice is just the first step and that government will follow through with treaty and truth, given the Uluru Statement from the Heart calls for all three?
Marcia.
It's a question often asked. In fact, there's a group who call themselves the Progressive No's who are against the voice because they want a treaty first. I think they represent a profound misunderstanding about, first of all, the nature of the potential treaties in Australia, but also a profound misunderstanding of how the governmental arrangements in Australia work. So Victoria was the first cab off the rank in legislating for a treaty process, and it's been very successful, and I believe that Ngarra has just been elected in the second First People's Assembly election. So this is the second term of that assembly, and we imagined when we were writing our voice co-design report that assembly would be the basis for the regional voice arrangements in Victoria, because there are representatives drawn from a number of regions in Victoria, and they could advise on how they want to develop their own regional voices on the basis of self-determination. So Victoria is the most advanced jurisdiction in terms of negotiating a treaty, and I believe that they're now moving towards the actual negotiations. We have treaty processes also in the Northern Territory, and maybe Marlarndirri can talk about that, and also in Queensland. In Queensland there's legislation, and the treaty process is well underway in Queensland as well. So whether there would be a statewide treaty or a number of treaties based on, the peoples such as Gunaikurnai or, Yorta or whatever, that is up to the local peoples to decide. But you all see, the other thing is, we already have hundreds of Indigenous land use agreements. So the Uluru Statement from the Heart refers to agreement making. So voice treaty truth doesn't just refer to what people imagine treaties to be, but also to the entire agreement making process. They're a fundamental part of the Native Title Act is the right of people with native title interests to sit at the table and negotiate the terms of proposals on their country. And as a result, most of these agreements are already in place. There are hundreds that they're legally binding contracts registered in the federal court, and corporations and companies and institutions, Telstra, have these partnership arrangements with the traditional owners all over the country. As we go forward, it's very important, I think, to read that report of, I believe, the Referendum Council and, the Uluru Dialogues on the Macarata, which is a term that the great man from here gifted to the Uluru Convention as a, very important, powerful word for settling conflicts. And so as people figure out how Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are going to live in this country and on what terms, he wanted that to be, decisive and peaceful. And but so many people have negotiated away their native title rights, their civil rights, and there are many agreements that fall below acceptable standards. And so a Macarata Commission would then give advice to local groups on the standards that they should maintain, especially so that they don't negotiate away their own rights. If they don't have good enough lawyers, if they've got, people from the state government on the other side of the table who are tough negotiators, they might, forego an existing right. And we've seen that happen in a great many cases. So it's a complicated field. All of this is on the public record. It's, as I say, in law in several jurisdictions. It's registered on the National Native Title Tribunal website, all of the agreements.
Yeah, it's out there. You mentioned lawyers. Taylah, you're a lawyer. This is an area that you have been thinking a lot about. What's your take on it?
I like what Ben says at the start. I don't think an advisory committee is enough, and I like what Professor Marcia Langton says as well, that a treaty is not enough on its own. Dan, you and I spoke the other week about the United States and what they were doing, and I told you we shouldn't compare apples to oranges because somebody told me that. But it's important to draw on the lessons on what foreign jurisdictions are doing. They had 400 treaties, over 400 treaties and agreements in totals. One of them is yet to be honoured in totality, just one. So we need something more here in Australia as well. And I love looking at the United States to see what they're doing. And one thing, their approach is that they have what's called a fiduciary duty, that to look after and work on treaties with its First Nations people. And from that, they've created what's called an Indian Claims Commission, which went from 1946 to 1978. And that dealt with fraudulent land transactions, a lot like what's happening here. And it had binding decisions as well. It had an arbitrator, and whatever the decision was from that commission, it was binding. And it's not perfect, but I truly do believe it's a first step in general policy of restitution for the past betrayals. We could implement something like that here. I think the Macarata Commission sounds fabulous. On the proviso that, there's binding decisions, because we look at New Zealand and we see what they're doing with their Treaty of Waitangi Tribunal, and it gives recommendations. We know the issues with recommendations. The government doesn't follow that.
I think I'd maybe add to that, and to answer the question, what reassurances can I give? None. I mean, every time we've gone to the well, we've been pushed in. The Solicitor General's advice is clear that, the government doesn't have to listen, acknowledge, respond to any of the advice that it's given. The language has changed throughout the campaign significantly. So I don't think that we can give any reassurances. And I think there is good theory and reasoning for why there's a lot of grassroots people that do want treaty first. I recognise also why groups like Woodside and the Minerals Council and all these other fossil fuel companies that are in support of the Yes campaign would want a voice first. So I think, and maybe building on what Taylor's just said, I don't see a treaty as an end game either. I think it's a first step in itself, but I think genuine agreement making that actually deals with the voice doesn't deal with the heart of the issue here, that there's a foreign entity that's been imposed on these lands. I think we need to get to the heart of it with maturity, with the guise of reckoning, and treaty and agreement making is absolutely something that we should continue to pursue. And
can I just jump in on that as well? I think a lot of the broader public forget the skills that First Nations people possess. In my fourth year of law school, I remember Dr. Bin Lee, the very first words that he said to our class was, Indigenous Australians are supreme dispute revolutionists and supreme negotiators. That is our innate heritage. That's us. And I want to flag as well, the government's buying back land, and I've had the privilege of sitting in with my supervisor, and we spoke about the pine plantation forest, where the government purchased 125 hectares of freehold title land to harvest trees, and nobody is batting an eyelid about that.
Marlarndirri, I just want to run down this question with you. The question goes to reassurances from the government about the voice being a starting point, and then treaty and truth. And of course, we've heard about the Macarata Commission. What do you see as the government's role in a Macarata Commission and truth-telling as part of that?
Well, the Prime Minister said on the night, Dan, when we won the election, that we would follow through with the Uluru Statement from the Heart in full, voice, treaty, truth. And it is important. Our country has a history here that we need to look into, and Macarata is an important word, and we have different words in each of the different First Nations groups that are coming together after a struggle and conflict. There is a great sense of healing in that process, but truth-telling is critical, not only as a nation, you know, in terms of our country as a whole, but also individually, in families, in what we do and how we conduct ourselves. So we are absolutely focused, of course, on the first point of that, and that's the voice. We know how tough it is to win a referendum in this country. We've walked into this knowing how tough it is. Certainly it's been made tougher by not having the kind of bipartisan support that we had certainly hoped for. And we have to stay focused on that, Dan. In all the years that I've been able to work and certainly serve the people of the Northern Territory, whether it's at a federal level or in the Northern Territory Parliament, I too have looked at the structure of the Westminster system and see that unless we have the opportunity for First Nations people to influence the system in quite an important way, like a voice to the Parliament, then I think we're going to continue with the status quo as much as, you know, and it's interesting listening to Ben and Taylah, but, you know, from my experience in the Parliament, we need to have a greater sense of strength and power in being able to influence, and I do believe the voice would do that if we are successful.